Chapter 1. Marcus Hartwell had been in the antique business long enough to recognize when someone was lying about an estate sale. The nervous woman fidgeting across from him in his shop, Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, according to her driver's license, claimed she was liquidating her recently deceased aunt's collection. But her hands shook when she talked about the music box, and she wouldn't meet his eyes when he asked about its history. Aunt Vivian was very private about her collections, Mrs. Ashford said, wrapping and unwrapping the strap of her purse around her fingers. I just need it gone. All of it really, but especially that piece. Marcus examined the music box on his workbench with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 15 years buying and selling musical curiosities. It was extraordinary, easily 18th century, possibly earlier. The case was crafted from what appeared to be ebony and silver, inlaid with mother-of-pearl in patterns that seemed to shift subtly in the afternoon light streaming through his shop windows. The metalwork was exquisite, far beyond the skill of most period craftsmen. This is museum quality, Marcus said, running his fingers along the intricate engravings. Are you certain your aunt would want you to sell it rather than donate it to a collection? Mrs. Ashford's laugh was too sharp, too quick. I'm certain she'd want it as far from the family as possible. Marcus looked up at her, intrigued. In his experience, people only talked about antiques that way when there were stories attached, and stories usually meant higher value for the right collector. Was there some family history with the piece? Nothing I care to repeat. Mrs. Ashford stood abruptly, her purse clutched against her chest like a shield. Will you take it or not? I'll accept whatever you think is fair. That was Marcus's first warning sign. No one in an estate sale situation ever said they'd accept whatever was fair, unless they were desperate to get rid of something. But the music box was genuinely spectacular, and Marcus had built his reputation on finding exceptional pieces that other dealers missed. I'll need to have it evaluated by a specialist before I can make a final offer, he said. The mechanism appears to be intact, but I'd want to ensure it's functional before. Don't wind it up. The words came out so quickly they nearly stumbled over each other. Mrs. Ashford was staring at the music box with something that looked disturbingly like fear. Please, just don't wind it up. Marcus raised an eyebrows. Mrs. Ashford, if you're concerned about the mechanism being fragile, I can assure you I have extensive experience with delicate antique instruments. I wouldn't dream of operating it without proper. Promise me. She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Promise me you won't wind it up until you're absolutely certain you want to keep it. The desperation in her voice was genuine, and Marcus found himself nodding despite his confusion. Of course, I'll wait until after the authentication process. Mrs. Ashford released his wrist and stepped back, looking relieved but still tense. Good. That's very good. She pulled an envelope from her purse and placed it on the workbench beside the music box. Here's everything I could find about its provenance. Not much, I'm afraid, but it might help with your evaluation. After she left, Marcus sat alone in his shop with the music box and a growing sense that he'd just acquired something far more significant than a beautiful antique. The envelope contained only a few items: a bill of sale from 1923, a brief insurance appraisal from 1961, and a handwritten note in faded ink that simply read, "The melody remembers." Marcus photographed the music box from every angle, noting details that would help him research its origins. The craftsmanship was unlike anything he'd seen from the major European workshops of the period. The inlay work suggested influences from both French and German traditions, but with decorative elements that seemed almost organic in their complexity. The silver portions of the case bore hallmarks that Marcus couldn't immediately identify, and the keyhole was designed for what appeared to be a very specific type of key. Not the simple winding keys typically used for music boxes, but something more elaborate, almost ceremonial. Most intriguing of all were the tiny figures visible through the glass top of the box. Unlike the typical dancing couples or ballerinas found in music boxes of the period, these figures were arranged in what appeared to be a ballroom scene with dozens of miniature dancers, all positioned as if caught mid-movement in an elaborate waltz. Marcus had never seen anything like it. The level of detail was extraordinary. Each figure was individually crafted and painted, and even without magnification, He could make out the expressions on their tiny faces. Some looked joyful, others appeared to be caught in the ecstasy of dance. But a few seemed to wear expressions of what might have been terror. That evening, Marcus called his most trusted contact in the musical instrument authentication business. "David, it's Marcus Hartwell. I've got something I'd like you to take a look at when you have a chance." David Chun had been restoring antique musical instruments for over 20 years, and Marcus had worked with him on dozens of pieces. If anyone could tell him about the music box's origins and value, it would be David. "What kind of piece?" David asked. "Music box. 18th century, possibly earlier. Extraordinary craftsmanship, but I can't identify the maker or even narrow down the region with confidence." "Sounds interesting. Can you send me some photos?" Marcus spent the next hour taking detailed photographs of every aspect of the music box, from the overall case to close-ups of the individual dancing figures. As he worked, he found himself humming unconsciously. A melody that seemed to come from nowhere, simple and haunting and strangely familiar. He was uploading the images when he realized he had no idea where the tune had come from. It wasn't anything he recognized, but it felt like something he'd known all his life. Marcus tried to shake it off, focusing on the technical details of his correspondence with David. But the melody lingered in the back of his mind like a half-remembered dream. After sending the photos, Marcus locked the music box in his secure storage room with his other high-value pieces. But as he turned off the lights and prepared to leave for the evening, he could have sworn he heard something from behind the storage room door, the faintest sound of music, like a waltz being played very softly on a distant gramophone. Marcus paused, key in hand, listening. But the sound didn't repeat, and after a moment he decided it must have been traffic noise from the street outside, or perhaps the old building's pipes settling for the night. Still, as he drove home, he found himself humming that strange, beautiful melody again. Chapter 2. Marcus woke the next morning with the tune still in his head. It had followed him through his dreams, weaving in and out of sleeping thoughts with a persistence that was both pleasant and slightly unsettling. He'd had songs stuck in his head before, of course, but this felt different somehow, less like remembering music and more like the music was actively playing somewhere just beyond his conscious awareness. Over coffee, he tried to identify the melody. It had the structure of a waltz, but with harmonic progressions that seemed more complex than typical 18th century compositions. There was something almost mathematical about the way the phrases built on each other, each repetition adding layers of complexity that made the simple tune increasingly compelling. Marcus found himself tapping out the rhythm on his kitchen table, his fingers automatically finding the patterns even though he had no formal musical training. The more he focused on it, the more intricate the melody seemed to become, as if his attention was unlocking additional layers of composition that had been hidden beneath the surface. By the time he reached his shop, Marcus had unconsciously choreographed a set of small movements to accompany the tune. A slight sway of his shoulders, a barely perceptible shuffle step as he walked, gestures that felt natural and necessary, as if the melody demanded physical expression. The first call came just after he opened. "Marcus, this is David. I got your photos last night, and I have to say, I'm fascinated by this piece. Can you bring it by my workshop today?" "You recognize the style?" "Not exactly, but there are elements that remind me of some very rare European pieces from the late 1700s. The metalwork especially. It's similar to some ceremonial instruments I've seen from that period, but far more sophisticated. I'd need to examine it in person to be certain, but this could be incredibly valuable." Marcus felt a thrill of professional satisfaction. Finding pieces that impressed experts like David was what made the antique business rewarding. "I can bring it by this afternoon if that works for you." "Perfect. And Marcus, have you wound it up yet? I'm curious about the sound quality." Marcus hesitated, remembering Mrs. Ashford's strange warning. "Not yet. The previous owner was concerned about the mechanism being fragile." "Understandable. We'll test it together when you get here. I have the proper tools if the spring mechanism needs any adjustment." After hanging up, Marcus returned to his storage room to retrieve the music box. As he lifted it from the shelf, he noticed something odd. The dancing figures inside seemed to be positioned differently than they had been the day before. He was almost certain that the central couple had been facing toward the front of the box when he'd locked it away, but now they appeared to be turned slightly to the left, as if they'd moved during the night. Marcus examined the box more closely, looking for some mechanism that might allow the figures to shift position automatically. Some high-end music boxes included rotating platforms or other moving elements, but he couldn't see any obvious mechanical explanation for the change. More likely, he decided, his memory was simply playing tricks on him. After all, the previous day had been full of new details and impressions. It would be easy to misremember exactly how the figures had been arranged. The drive to David's workshop took 20 minutes, and Marcus found himself humming the persistent melody for the entire journey. By the time he arrived, he'd begun adding small flourishes and variations, elaborating on the basic tune in ways that felt completely natural, as if he were remembering additional verses of a song he'd always known. David Chen's workshop occupied the basement of an old brownstone, filled with the tools and instruments of someone who had spent decades working with delicate mechanical objects. Partially disassembled music boxes, player piano mechanisms, and antique clockwork devices covered every available surface. "Let me see it," David said immediately, his eyes lighting up with professional curiosity. Marcus placed the music box on David's main workbench, and they both stood looking at it in the bright light of David's examination lamps. "Extraordinary," David murmured, pulling on a pair of magnifying glasses. "Look at this inlay work. The precision is incredible. And these hallmarks." He peered closely at the silver portions of the case. "I don't recognize them, but the style suggests continental European, probably Austrian or German." As David examined the external case, Marcus found himself focusing on the dancing figures visible through the glass top. In the bright workshop lighting, the detail was even more remarkable than he'd initially realized. Each figure was not just individually crafted but seemed to possess its own unique personality. The central couple appeared to be caught in a moment of perfect synchronization, their faces reflecting the joy of flawless partnership in dance. But as Marcus looked more closely, he began to notice disturbing details. Some of the figures around the edges of the scene appeared to be struggling, their tiny faces twisted in expressions that looked less like joy and more like exhaustion or distress. A few seemed to be reaching toward the glass top of the box, as if trying to escape the eternal dance. "David," Marcus said, "take a look at these figures. Some of them look." But when he glanced over at his colleague, David had stopped his examination and was staring at the music box with an expression Marcus had never seen before. A look of complete absorption, as if nothing else in the world existed except the object before him. "David." David didn't respond. He was humming, the same melody that had been in Marcus's head since the previous evening. But where Marcus had been unconsciously embellishing the tune, David was humming it with perfect precision, as if he were reading from sheet music that only he could see. "David, are you all right?" David's humming stopped abruptly, and he blinked as if waking from a daydream. "Sorry, what were you saying?" "I was asking you to look at the figures. Some of them seem to have odd expressions." David looked down at the dancing figures and nodded slowly. "Yes, I see what you mean. Very unusual for a music box of this period. Most craftsmen would have made all the figures uniformly cheerful." But even as he spoke, David's attention seemed to drift back to the melody he'd been humming. Marcus could see him fighting the urge to continue the tune, his fingers tapping unconsciously against the workbench in rhythm with music only he could hear. "Should we wind it up?" Marcus asked. "Test the mechanism?" David's eyes snapped back to focus with an intensity that was almost startling. "Yes," he said. "Yes. I think we should definitely wind it up." Marcus reached for the ornate key that Mrs. Ashford had provided, but as his fingers touched the metal, he felt a moment of hesitation. The key was warm, warmer than it should have been after sitting in his pocket for the drive over. And for just an instant, as he lifted it toward the keyhole, he could have sworn he heard something from inside the music box, a sound like tiny voices calling out in harmony. But David was watching him expectantly, and Marcus's curiosity about the piece overcame his momentary unease. He inserted the key and began to wind the mechanism. The spring mechanism turned smoothly, with the precision of a master craftsman's work. As Marcus wound the key, he could feel the tension building inside the box, like potential energy waiting to be released. "That should be sufficient," David said, though his voice sounded oddly distant. "Go ahead and release it." Marcus lifted the lid of the music box. The melody that emerged was the same tune that had been haunting him since the previous evening. But hearing it played by the actual mechanism was completely different from the version in his head. This was the complete composition. Not just the simple waltz he'd been humming, but a complex, layered piece of music that seemed to contain harmonies and counter-melodies that were somehow simultaneously audible. As the music played, the dancing figures began to move. Marcus had expected simple rotation or basic mechanical motion, but the figures moved with fluid grace, each one following its own choreographed pattern, while remaining in perfect synchronization with the others. The central couple waltzed with movements so lifelike they seemed almost to breathe, while the surrounding figures spun and turned in increasingly complex patterns. Marcus found himself swaying to the music without realizing it, his body naturally responding to the perfect three-quarter time. Beside him, David had begun to move as well. Small steps at first, just shifting his weight from foot to foot, but gradually becoming more elaborate. The music was beautiful beyond anything Marcus had ever heard. Each phrase built on the last, creating a sense of mounting emotional intensity that made him want to move, to dance, to surrender himself completely to the perfect mathematical precision of the composition. It was David who broke the spell. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight with what might have been fear. "Marcus, we need to close it. Now." But Marcus was lost in the music, his feet beginning to trace the basic patterns of a waltz he'd never learned but somehow knew perfectly. The melody had layers upon layers, and the more he listened, the more he could hear. Additional instruments, voices joining in harmony, the sound of a full ballroom orchestra playing for an audience of hundreds. "Marcus!" David grabbed his arm. "Close the box." The physical contact broke Marcus's concentration just enough for him to realize what was happening. He was dancing, actually dancing, there in David's workshop, moving to music that came from a mechanical toy. But more disturbing still, he didn't want to stop. The melody was calling to him, promising perfect harmony, perfect movement, perfect joy if he would just surrender to its rhythm. With an effort that felt like tearing part of himself away, Marcus reached out and slammed the lid of the music box shut. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus and David stood in the sudden quiet, both breathing heavily, both staring at the closed music box as if it might spring open on its own. "What the hell was that?" David whispered. Marcus didn't have an answer, but as they stood there in the aftermath, he realized that the melody was still playing in his head. Not as a memory, but as if the music box were still open, still calling to him from inside its closed case. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, he could hear the faint sound of people dancing. Chapter 3. 3 days later, Marcus was losing time. He'd find himself standing in his shop with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His feet positioned in the basic stance of a waltz, the melody playing so clearly in his mind that he sometimes looked around for the source of the music. Yesterday he'd come to behind his counter, having apparently spent 20 minutes practicing dance steps while a customer waited patiently to ask about a Victorian writing desk. The music box sat in his storage room, unopened since the incident at David's workshop, but its presence filled the entire building like a low-frequency hum that Marcus could feel in his bones. Sometimes he caught himself walking in three-quarter time, his footsteps automatically matching the rhythm that played endlessly in his head. David had called twice, his voice increasingly strained. The first time, he claimed he needed to see the music box again to complete his authentication. The second call had been mostly incoherent. Something about needing to hear the complete melody, about missing crucial harmonies that were just beyond his ability to remember. Marcus hadn't returned the calls. Something was wrong with both of them, and he suspected the music box was the cause. But rather than getting rid of the piece as his rational mind suggested, he found himself making excuses to stay near it, to research its origins, to understand what he'd stumbled into. The historical research had yielded disturbing results. The bill of sale from 1923 led him to auction house records, which connected to an estate clearance from a mansion in Savannah. The insurance appraisal from 1961 included a photograph that showed the music box in a display case alongside other curiosities and supernatural artifacts, collected by someone named Colonel Thaddeus Whitmore. Most intriguing was the handwritten note. The melody remembers. VA, a genealogy search had revealed that VA was likely Vivian Ashford, Mrs. Eleanor Ashford's aunt, who had supposedly died recently. But county records showed that Vivian Ashford had actually died in 1987, in the state psychiatric hospital, after 30 years of treatment for what the records euphemistically called dancing mania. Marcus was beginning to understand why Mrs. Ashford had been so desperate to get rid of the music box. But understanding the danger didn't seem to diminish his growing obsession with the piece. If anything, the knowledge that it was genuinely supernatural made him more determined to unlock its secrets. That's when he decided to contact Dr. Sarah Chen. Marcus had read Dr. Chen's paper on inherited property psychology 6 months earlier, as part of his research into why certain antiques seem to carry emotional weight beyond their material value. Her work on environmental factors and suggestions seemed directly relevant to what he was experiencing, even if she approached it from a purely psychological perspective. He crafted his email carefully. Dr. Chun, I hope you remember our correspondence regarding your paper on inherited trauma narratives. I'm writing because I've encountered an antique music box that seems to be causing unusual psychological effects in anyone who hears it played. I realize this sounds like a case study from your research, but the phenomena are remarkably consistent across multiple witnesses. Would you be available for a consultation? I can provide detailed documentation of the effects, historical provenance, and the piece itself for your examination. Respectfully, Marcus Hartwell, Hartwell Antiquities. Marcus sent the email before he could second-guess himself. Dr. Chun might think he was delusional, but she was the only expert he could find who had taken seriously the idea that objects could affect human psychology in measurable ways. While waiting for her response, he decided to contact one more specialist, Dr. Amanda Foster, a musicologist at the local university who had helped him authenticate a Civil War-era parlor piano the year before. If the melody itself held clues to the music box's origins, Amanda would be the person to identify them. But when Marcus called Amanda's office, her graduate assistant informed him that Dr. Foster was unavailable and had been so for the past week. Is she ill? Marcus asked. Not exactly, the assistant said, sounding troubled. She's been coming to the office, but, well, she's been behaving strangely, spending all her time in the piano practice rooms, playing the same piece over and over. The facility staff say she's there until late at night, and sometimes they find her in the morning still at the piano. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What piece has she been playing? That's just it, nobody recognizes it. Sounds like a waltz, but incredibly complex. Some of the other faculty members have complained that it's distracting. People have been avoiding the music building because the melody is so compelling it interferes with their own work. After hanging up, Marcus sat in his shop and tried to think rationally about what was happening. The music box was affecting people who had never seen it, never wounded up themselves. David had only heard the melody once, and it was clearly influencing his behavior. Now Amanda was apparently playing the same tune obsessively, despite never having encountered the source. The melody was spreading. Marcus pulled up Amanda's faculty page and found her office address. He needed to see what she was playing, to confirm whether it was the same melody that had been haunting his thoughts for days. But more than that, he was beginning to suspect that the music box wasn't just a cursed antique. It was the epicenter of something that was actively growing, spreading, infecting everyone who came into contact with its influence. His computer chimed with Dr. Chen's response. Mr. Hartwell, your case sounds fascinating from a psychological perspective. I've been researching similar phenomena related to object-associated suggestion and environmental influence on perception. I'd be very interested in examining both the piece itself and documenting the effects you've experienced. Are you available for a consultation this week? Given the nature of the phenomena you've described, I think it would be best if I came to your location rather than having you transport the object. I should mention that I have some experience with cases where antique objects seem to produce unusual psychological effects. Your situation may be more significant than a simple case study. Best regards, Dr. Sarah Chun. Marcus stared at the email for a long time. Dr. Chen's last paragraph suggested she had encountered genuinely supernatural phenomena before, despite her academic credentials in psychology. Maybe she would understand that what was happening went beyond environmental suggestion or inherited trauma narratives. But even as he typed his response confirming the appointment, Marcus found himself unconsciously swaying to the melody that continued to play in the depths of his mind. And somewhere, just at the edge of his hearing, he could swear he heard the sound of a full orchestra. Not a mechanical music box, but dozens of real instruments playing in perfect harmony, accompanied by the whisper of dancing feet on a distant ballroom floor. The melody was getting stronger. Chapter 4. Dr. Chun arrived at Marcus's shop on a gray Thursday morning, carrying equipment that looked like it belonged in a paranormal investigation rather than a psychology consultation. Digital thermometers, electromagnetic field detectors, and high-sensitivity audio recorders were arranged in a professional-looking case alongside more traditional psychological assessment tools. "I've learned to bring comprehensive documentation equipment," she explained when she saw Marcus's surprised expression. "Environmental factors can be crucial in cases like this." Marcus liked her immediately. Dr. Chun approached the situation with scientific rigor, but without the automatic dismissal he'd expected from an academic. When he described the music box's effects, she took detailed notes and asked specific questions about timing, physical sensations, and the progression of symptoms. "You mentioned that the melody seems to be affecting people who haven't heard the original music box," she said. "Can you be more specific about that?" Marcus told her about David's increasingly erratic behavior and Amanda's obsessive piano playing. As he spoke, he found himself unconsciously humming fragments of the melody, and he noticed Dr. Chen's attention sharpen immediately. "That tune you're humming," she said, "is that from the music box?" "Yes, but it's not. I'm not trying to hum it. It just happens. The melody is always there, just under the surface of my thoughts." Dr. Chun made more notes, then looked up at him with an expression that was both professional and concerned. "Mr. Hartwell, I need to ask you to stop humming, right now, and for the duration of my visit." "I'm sorry. I didn't realize. It's not your fault. But I need you to understand that what you're describing sounds like a form of mimetic transmission. If the melody itself is the vector for whatever psychological effects you're experiencing, then hearing it could expose me to the same phenomena." Marcus felt a flash of panic. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you. I can leave, or we can meet somewhere else." "No," Dr. Chun said firmly. "This is exactly why I'm here. But we need to take precautions." She pulled out what appeared to be noise-canceling headphones. "I'm going to examine the music box itself, but I want you to wear these. They'll play white noise to mask any auditory input. Can you show me where you keep it?" Marcus led her to the storage room, noting that she was documenting everything with both written notes and digital photography. When he opened the case containing the music box, Dr. Chun spent several minutes photographing it from every angle without touching it. "Remarkable craftsmanship," she murmured. "And you said the figures inside seem to move when the mechanism is activated?" "More than move, they dance. Each one follows its own choreography, but they're all perfectly synchronized." Dr. Chun leaned closer to examine the dancing figures, and Marcus saw her expression change. "Mr. Hartwell, some of these figures, their expressions are quite disturbing. I noticed that too. Some of them look terrified." "It's more than that." Dr. Chun pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the figures more carefully. "Look at this one here, near the edge. It's not just afraid, it's trying to get out. See how it's reaching toward the glass." Marcus looked where she was pointing and felt his stomach drop. The figure she was examining was positioned differently than he remembered. When he'd first seen it, the tiny dancer had been facing inward, toward the center of the ballroom scene. Now it was turned toward the glass top, one hand pressed against the transparent barrier, its painted face twisted in an expression of desperate pleading. "They're moving," Marcus whispered. Even when the box is closed, they're moving. Dr. Chun stepped back from the music box immediately. We need to discuss this somewhere else, away from the object itself. They returned to the main shop, where Dr. Chun set up her recording equipment and began a more formal interview. Marcus found it strangely relieving to talk about his experiences with someone who took them seriously, who asked follow-up questions instead of suggesting he seek psychiatric help. The progression you're describing is consistent with what I might expect from a genuinely supernatural influence, Dr. Chun said. The gradual increase in compulsive behavior, the persistence of auditory hallucinations, the physical manifestations, these aren't typical of purely psychological phenomena. You believe it's really supernatural? I've encountered similar cases. Objects that seem to carry genuine psychic or spiritual influences, usually connected to traumatic historical events. Dr. Chun paused, choosing her words carefully. In my experience, the most dangerous artifacts are those that were created specifically to trap or manipulate human consciousness. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. What do you mean, created specifically? Think about it. A music box that compels people to dance, with figures that appear to be trapped inside, playing a melody that spreads like a contagion. That's not a coincidence. Someone designed this object to do exactly what it's doing. Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number. I should take this, Marcus said, then answered. David, how are you? What came through the phone wasn't words but music, the melody from the music box, but played on what sounded like a full orchestra. The sound quality was impossibly clear, as if David were calling from inside a concert hall. Dr. Chun immediately grabbed the phone from Marcus's hand and ended the call. Don't listen to that, she said urgently. If the melody is being transmitted through electronic media, then the infection vector is expanding exponentially. Marcus's phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed Amanda Foster's number. Dr. Chun looked at Marcus grimly. How many people have you been in contact with about this music box? David, Amanda, Mrs. Ashford who sold it to me. Marcus tried to think. My insurance agent for the appraisal, the auction house that handled the estate sale. We need to find out how far this has spread. And more importantly, we need to find out how to stop it. Dr. Chun began packing up her equipment. Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to need you to come with me. We need to research the historical origins of this object. And we need to do it somewhere safe. Away from the music box and away from anyone who might be under its influence. What about my shop? What about the music box itself? Lock it up. Don't touch it. Don't wind it, and whatever you do, don't listen to any phone calls or audio messages until we figure out what we're dealing with. As Marcus secured the shop and set the alarm, he could hear his phone buzzing with incoming calls from numbers he didn't recognize. The melody was spreading through his professional network, reaching people he'd never contacted directly, propagating like a virus through electronic communication. Dr. Chun was right. This wasn't just a cursed antique anymore. It was the center of something that was actively growing, infecting everyone it touched, spreading outward in concentric circles of influence. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Marcus could still hear that perfect, terrible melody, calling to him with the promise of perfect movement, perfect harmony, perfect surrender to the rhythm of an eternal dance. Chapter 5. Dr. Chen's research facility turned out to be a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, filled with what she called contained artifacts. Objects that had demonstrated supernatural properties but were too dangerous to keep in normal academic settings. Marcus recognized some of the containment methods from movies about hazardous materials. Sealed cases, climate control systems, and what appeared to be electromagnetic isolation chambers. This is where I study objects that can't be safely examined in a university setting, Dr. Chin explained as she led Marcus to a workspace that looked like a combination laboratory and library. After the incident with the Vellum Manor wallpapers, I realized I needed a facility specifically designed for supernatural research. Marcus wanted to ask about the wallpapers, but Dr. Chun was already pulling books from shelves and booting up multiple computer systems. We need to trace the provenance of your music box as far back as possible, she said. If someone created it deliberately to trap or influence people, there should be historical records of similar phenomena. They worked for hours, following paper trails through auction records, estate sales, and private collections. The music box had changed hands frequently, rarely staying with one owner for more than a few years, often sold quickly after acquisitions, sometimes donated to museums that then quietly disposed of it. "Look at this pattern," Dr. Chun said, pointing to a timeline she'd constructed. "Every owner reports the same progression: initial fascination, compulsive behavior, then either death or institutionalization. The Whitmore collection in Savannah acquired it in 1923, but Colonel Whitmore was dead within 6 months. Cause of death listed as exhaustion following prolonged physical activity. He danced himself to death? It appears so. And look at this. His estate records mention that servants found him in the ballroom, still moving to music that no one else could hear, even after he'd collapsed." Dr. Chun pulled up another document. The music box was sold immediately after his death to a private collector in New Orleans. That collector, Marie Touzé, was institutionalized within a year. Hospital records describe acute dancing mania and auditory hallucinations. Marcus studied the timeline with growing dread. How far back can we trace it? The earliest record I can find is from 1789 in Vienna. It was part of the estate of someone called Madame Elisabetta Fontaine, described as a dance instructor to European nobility. Dr. Chun pulled up a digitized document from the Austrian State Archives. The German text was accompanied by an English translation that made Marcus's blood run cold. The Fontaine woman was found dead in her private ballroom, apparently having danced for days without rest or sustenance. The constables report that her body showed signs of extreme physical exhaustion, but her face bore an expression of rapturous joy, as if she had died in a moment of perfect ecstasy. Of particular note is the music box found at the scene, a remarkable piece that played continuously despite no visible means of winding. The melody was so compelling that several of the investigating officers found themselves unable to stop dancing until forcibly removed from the premises. Students came from across the continent to study with her. Students who then became trapped in the music box. Exactly. And when Fontaine died, the entity she'd bargained with didn't disappear. It remained bound to the music box, continuing to collect souls from anyone who heard the complete melody. Marcus thought about David's increasingly erratic phone calls, about Amanda playing obsessively in the university practice rooms, about his own growing compulsion to dance whenever the melody played in his head. "How many people do you think are affected by now?" Dr. Chun looked at her timeline of the music box's ownership. If the pattern holds and the influence is spreading through electronic transmission, potentially dozens, maybe hundreds, and they'll all end up like Fontaine and the others, dancing until they die, unless we can find a way to break the binding. Dr. Chun stood up and began pacing. Every supernatural artifact has a weakness, some way to disrupt the entity's connection to our world. We just need to figure out what it is. Marcus's phone, which had been silent for the past several hours, suddenly rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he looked at Dr. Chun, she nodded grimly. "Answer it," she said, "but put it on speaker, and be ready to hang up immediately if you hear the melody." Marcus accepted the call. What came through the phone wasn't music this time, but a voice, cultured, with a faint European accent that seemed to come from another century. "Mr. Hartwell," the voice said, "you've been asking questions about my collection. Perhaps it's time we spoke directly." Chapter 6. Dr. Chun immediately began recording the call while Marcus tried to keep his voice steady. "Who is this? I think you know." The voice carried an amused undertone, as if the speaker found Marcus's question delightfully naive. "I am the artist responsible for the exquisite piece you've acquired, the composer of the melody that has been occupying your thoughts. You're the entity that Madame Fontaine bargained with." Such crude terminology. I prefer to think of myself as a patron of the arts, a collector of perfect moments. Elisabetta came to me seeking transcendence, the ability to create movement so beautiful it would be remembered for centuries. I simply provided the means. Dr. Chun was frantically taking notes, her face pale but focused. She held up a piece of paper with a single word written on it. "Stall." What do you want? Marcus asked. Want? My dear fellow, I have everything I require. Centuries of perfect performances. An ever-growing collection of souls who have achieved the ultimate expression of the dance. Your friend David has joined us, and the charming Professor Foster. She plays my composition with such passion. Marcus felt sick. They're trapped? Like the figures in the music box. Trapped is such a negative word. They are preserved, transformed, made eternal. David will never again worry about the limitations of his mortal body. He dances now with perfect precision. Forever. Amanda's piano playing has achieved a level of technical mastery that no living human could match. Because they're not living anymore. The voice laughed, a sound like crystal bells with an underlying discordance that made Marcus's teeth ache. Life and death are merely different states of being. I offer something far more valuable, the possibility of perfection. Dr. Chun held up another note. Ask about the binding. How does it work? Marcus asked. How do you trap souls in the music box? Ah, now you're asking the interesting questions. The voice took on a lecturing tone. The mechanism is quite elegant, really. The melody serves as both lure and snare. Each person who hears the complete composition becomes attuned to its frequency, shall we say. The more they listen, the more deeply they resonate with the supernatural harmonics embedded within the music. And then they begin to dance. Not by choice, you understand, but because the melody has synchronized with their life force, their essential rhythm. Eventually, the physical body can no longer sustain the perfect movement demanded by the composition, and at the moment of death, that moment is exquisite. The soul is drawn into the music box to join the eternal performance. Marcus looked at Dr. Chun, who was writing furiously. She showed him her notes. Physical death releases soul, binding happens at moment of exhaustion. What if someone destroys the music box? Marcus asked. The laughter this time was genuinely delighted. Oh, my dear collector, do you think you're the first to consider that approach? The music box is merely an anchor, a focal point for the binding. The true power resides in the melody itself, and that melody now exists in dozens of minds, on countless recordings, spreading through your marvelous modern communication networks. Marcus's heart sank. Even if they destroyed the physical object, the supernatural song would continue to spread, continue to claim victims. Besides, the voice continued, destroying the music box would release all the souls currently bound within it. And I assure you, after centuries of perfect, eternal dance, they are quite changed. Not the sort of spirits you'd want wandering free in your world. Dr. Chun held up a new note. What does it need to complete the collection? You mentioned Fontaine wanted transcendence, Marcus said. What did you get out of the bargain? Sustenance, dear boy. Each perfect performance feeds me, strengthens me, allows me to exist in your reality rather than the much less interesting dimensions from which I originated. But more than that, each soul I collect brings me closer to my ultimate goal, which is to achieve physical manifestation in your world. Currently, I can only influence events through the music box and the melody it contains. But when I have collected sufficient souls, when the binding is strong enough, I will be able to take corporeal form and collect performances directly. The implication was horrifying. If the entity could manifest physically, it wouldn't need to wait for people to hear the melody and gradually succumb to its influence. Could simply force them to dance. How many souls do you need? That would be telling. But I will say that thanks to your modern technology, I'm much closer to that goal than I was even a week ago. The rate of collection has increased exponentially. Dr. Chun was writing something longer now, holding up pages of notes for Marcus to read. Traditional bindings have specific rules. Ask about time limits, seasonal connections, lunar cycles. There might be windows when it's vulnerable. Are there restrictions on your power? Marcus asked. Times when the binding is weaker? The voice paused for the first time in the conversation, and Marcus sensed he'd hit on something important. All compacts have their terms and conditions, the entity said carefully. But those are hardly relevant to your situation. What kind of terms? Another pause, longer this time. The binding between Elisabetta and myself was sealed during a specific celestial alignment, what you might call a convergence of supernatural forces. Such alignments occur rarely, perhaps once every few centuries. Dr. Chun was nodding excitedly, writing, "Binding is strongest during alignment, weakest when alignment is furthest away." "When was the last alignment?" Marcus asked. 1789, the year of our initial compact. "The next such alignment will not occur for—" The voice trailed off, as if the entity realized it had said too much. "For how long?" "This conversation has become tedious, Mr. Hartwell. Allow me to make you an offer instead. Bring me the music box, the physical anchor, and I will release one soul of your choosing. David, perhaps, or the lovely Professor Foster. Consider it a gesture of good faith. And if I refuse? Then you will join them soon enough. The melody in your head grows stronger each day. Does it not? Soon you'll find yourself unable to resist its call. But rather than dying alone in your shop, gasping for breath as your body fails to keep pace with perfect rhythm, you could choose to be part of something transcendent." The line went dead. Dr. Chun and Marcus sat in stunned silence for several moments before she spoke. "We need to figure out when the celestial alignment is furthest from its peak. That's when the entity will be most vulnerable. How do we do that?" "I know someone who specializes in astronomical calculations for supernatural phenomena. Professor Martinez mentioned her when I called earlier. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an astrophysicist who studies celestial alignments and their connection to reported paranormal events." Dr. Chun was already dialing. "Elena? Sarah Chin. I need your help with an urgent calculation." Chapter 7. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived at the research facility 6 hours later, carrying what appeared to be a portable observatory's worth of equipment and several thick volumes on astronomical calculations. She was a small, intense woman with graying hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen enough unexplained phenomena to take Dr. Chen's request seriously. 1789 was indeed a year of remarkable celestial convergence. Elena confirmed after reviewing her calculations. Multiple planetary alignments, a particularly active solar cycle, and what historical records describe as unusual aurora activity at latitudes where such displays are typically impossible. She showed them a complex chart covered in orbital projections and mathematical formulas. If we're looking for the point of maximum divergence from that alignment, when all the same celestial bodies are in their most opposing positions, that would be— Elena ran calculations on her laptop while Marcus and Dr. Chun waited tensely. "Tomorrow night," Elena said finally. "The alignment reaches maximum opposition at 11:47 p.m. local time. If your entity's power is tied to the 1789 convergence, it will be at its absolute weakest for approximately 37 minutes around that time." "That's not much time," Marcus said. "It's enough," Dr. Chun replied. "But we need to understand exactly what we're trying to accomplish. Breaking the binding won't be as simple as smashing the music box during the vulnerable window." Elena looked up from her calculations. "Actually, it might be more complex than that. If the entity has been feeding on collected souls for over 2 centuries, destroying the binding could release an enormous amount of supernatural energy. Think of it like supernatural nuclear fission. What would that mean practically? Best case scenario? All the trapped souls are freed to move on to whatever comes after death. Worst case? The sudden release of that much concentrated spiritual energy could tear holes in reality, create permanent supernatural distortions, or give the entity enough power to manifest physically even without completing its collection." Dr. Chun was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's charts. "What if we don't try to destroy the binding, but redirect it?" "What do you mean?" "The entity needs the melody to maintain its connection to our reality, right? And it feeds on the souls of people who dance to that melody. But what if, during the vulnerable window, we could reverse the flow? Instead of the melody drawing souls into the music box, what if we could use it to pull the entity itself into a trap?" Elena nodded slowly. "That's actually theoretically sound. During maximum divergence, the entity would be struggling to maintain its current binding. If we presented it with what appeared to be an even stronger anchor, It might abandon the music box for what it perceived as a better host, Marcus finished. But what could serve as a trap powerful enough to contain something that's been growing stronger for centuries? Elena asked. Dr. Chun smiled grimly. I know exactly the right thing. Chapter 8. At 10:30 p.m. the following night, Marcus found himself back in his shop, surrounded by equipment that looked like a cross between an exorcism and a scientific experiment. Dr. Chun had spent the day preparing what she called a supernatural containment protocol, while Elena had set up astronomical monitoring equipment to track the exact moment of maximum celestial divergence. The music box sat in the center of the shop, its lid open, playing the cursed melody on an endless loop. But this time, Dr. Chun had surrounded it with a carefully constructed array of other objects. Items from her research facility that she claimed had their own supernatural properties but were currently dormant. The theory is simple, Dr. Chun explained as she made final adjustments to the arrangement. When the entity is at its weakest, we're going to offer it what appears to be a much more powerful anchor, a collection of artifacts that should seem irresistible to something looking for a stronger connection to our reality. And then we spring the trap. Dr. Chun showed Marcus a device that looked like a modified EMF detector. These artifacts aren't actually more powerful than the music box. They're bait. Once the entity attempts to transfer its binding to them, this device will create an electromagnetic pulse specifically calibrated to disrupt supernatural energy patterns. Elena checked her equipment. 15 minutes to maximum divergence. As they waited, Marcus became aware that the melody from the music box was affecting him more strongly than ever before. His feet had begun moving involuntarily, tracing the basic patterns of a waltz, and he could feel his body wanting to surrender completely to the rhythm. It's getting stronger, he said through gritted teeth. That's normal, Dr. Chun replied, though she sounded strained. As the celestial alignment shifts, the entity is pouring more power into maintaining its current binding. The melody becomes more compelling because it's fighting to keep its collected souls from breaking free. Elena suddenly looked up from her instruments. Something's wrong. The astronomical readings are... I've never seen anything like this. Marcus followed her gaze toward the shop windows and felt his blood freeze. The sky outside was wrong. Instead of normal darkness, there were swirls of color that looked almost like aurora, but far more vivid and active than any natural phenomenon. And underneath the shifting lights, Marcus could see figures moving, translucent forms that appeared to be dancing in the empty street. The barrier between dimensions is thinning, Dr. Chun said. The entity is pulling its collected souls partially back into our reality. Through the windows, Marcus could see David's ghostly form spinning in perfect waltz position with a partner who might have been Amanda. Behind them, dozens of other transparent figures moved in elaborate choreographed patterns, their faces showing the same expression of rapturous terror he'd noticed on the figures inside the music box. 2 minutes to maximum divergence, Elena announced. The melody from the music box was now overwhelming. Marcus found himself unable to stand still, his entire body compelled to move in increasingly complex dance steps. Dr. Chun was fighting the same compulsion, her hands shaking as she tried to monitor her equipment. Elena, can you resist it? Barely, Elena gasped. The astronomical alignment is amplifying the effect. I can feel the melody trying to synchronize with my heartbeat. 30 seconds. The dancing figures outside were becoming more solid, more real. Marcus could see their faces clearly now. David and Amanda, but also dozens of others, representing centuries of victims. Some wore clothing from the 18th century, others from more recent decades. All of them moved with inhuman precision, their expressions caught between ecstasy and horror. Now, Elena shouted. Dr. Chun activated the containment array. The supernatural artifacts around the music box began to glow with their own eerie light, and Marcus felt a sudden shift in the melody's compulsion, as if something vast and hungry had suddenly noticed the other objects and found them irresistible. For a moment it worked. The music box's melody faltered as the entity's attention was drawn to what it perceived as more powerful anchors. The dancing figures outside began to fade as the supernatural energy that maintained their manifestation was redirected. But then Marcus heard the voice again, the cultured, amused tone of the entity they were trying to trap. "Oh, my dear Dr. Chen," it said, the words seeming to come from the artifacts themselves. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize a trap constructed from objects in your own collection? I've been watching your research for months, learning about your methods, your weaknesses, your touching faith in scientific solutions to supernatural problems." The artifacts around the music box began to crack, unable to contain the entity's power as it flowed through them. "You see," the voice continued, "you've made a critical error. You assumed I needed to be bound to a single object, a single anchor. But centuries of feeding on human souls have made me far more versatile than that." The music box suddenly went silent, its mechanism ceasing completely. But the melody didn't stop. Instead, it began playing from every electronic device in the shop. Marcus's phone, Dr. Chen's recording equipment, Elena's astronomical instruments. All of them were broadcasting the cursed waltz at maximum volume. "I am no longer confined to a single vessel," the entity said, its voice now coming from every speaker simultaneously. "Thanks to your modern technology, I exist in every device that has ever played my melody, every network that has transmitted it, every mind that has heard it. You cannot trap something that has already escaped." The supernatural aurora outside intensified, and the dancing figures returned. But now they were solid, real, pressing against the shop windows with expressions that had moved beyond rapturous terror into something approaching rage. "But I do thank you for gathering in one place," the voice continued. "It makes collection so much more efficient." Marcus felt his body beginning to move against his will, his feet tracing increasingly complex patterns as the amplified melody overwhelmed his resistance. Beside him, Dr. Chan and Elena were also beginning to dance, their faces showing the same struggle between rational thought and supernatural compulsion. The trap had failed. The entity was stronger than they'd anticipated, more adaptable, more thoroughly integrated into the modern world than they'd realized. And now they were about to join the centuries of souls who had made the same mistake of underestimating the power of a perfect eternal dance. Chapter 9. As Marcus felt his body surrendering to the compulsive rhythm, a single thought cut through the supernatural melody's influence. The entity had made one crucial mistake. It had revealed that it existed now in every device, every network, every transmission of the melody. Which meant it was no longer concentrated in the music box. Which meant it was vulnerable to something the music box had never been susceptible to: electromagnetic disruption on a massive scale. "Elena!" Marcus shouted over the amplified waltz, fighting to maintain enough control to speak. "The solar storm data, from your astronomical readings? What's the electromagnetic intensity?" Elena was spinning in place, her scientific instruments scattered around her, but her eyes suddenly focused with understanding. "Massive solar flare. Peak intensity in 8 minutes. Enough to disrupt every electronic device within 50 miles. That's it," Dr. Chen gasped, her body moving in increasingly elaborate dance steps but her mind still functioning. "If the entity exists in the electronic networks now, a solar storm could sever its connections all at once. But 8 minutes was too long." Marcus could feel his consciousness beginning to blur, his individual will dissolving into the perfect mathematical precision of the waltz. Around him, the shop filled with the ghostly figures of previous victims, all moving in synchronized harmony, welcoming him into their eternal performance. That's when Marcus remembered something the entity had said during their phone conversation. Destroying the music box would release all the souls currently bound within it, and after centuries of perfect dance, they were quite changed. "Dr. Chan," Marcus called out, using what might have been his last moment of coherent thought. "What if the changed souls aren't corrupted? What if they're perfectly attuned to the melody's frequency?" Dr. Chen's eyes widened with understanding even as her body continued its involuntary waltz. They could serve as a conductor, channel the electromagnetic disruption directly into the entity's core. Marcus gathered every ounce of remaining willpower and threw himself toward the music box. The entity's voice rose in alarm as Marcus's hands closed around the delicate mechanism. But it was too late to stop him. Marcus smashed the music box against the floor. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Centuries of trapped souls burst from the shattered mechanism in a whirlwind of translucent forms. Not the peaceful release Dr. Chan had hoped for, but an explosion of spiritual energy that had been compressed and refined by centuries of perfect performance. The souls filled the shop, spinning in patterns that made Marcus's eyes water, but instead of escaping, they began to circle the electronic devices that were still broadcasting the melody. Each soul had become a living antenna, perfectly tuned to the supernatural frequency that had held them captive. Outside, the solar flare reached its peak intensity. The electromagnetic pulse hit the town like an invisible tsunami, and every electronic device within 50 miles went dark simultaneously. But in Marcus's shop, the released souls channeled that same electromagnetic energy into something far more focused and devastating. A supernatural feedback loop that traveled instantly through every network connection the entity had claimed, every device it had infected, every transmission of the cursed melody. The entity's scream of rage and agony came from everywhere at once. The dead electronics, the empty air, the walls themselves, as centuries of accumulated power was torn away in seconds. Marcus, Dr. Chan, and Elena collapsed as the compulsive melody finally ended, leaving behind only the sound of their exhausted breathing and the whisper of spiritual forms finally finding peace. The ghostly figures that had been pressing against the windows were gone. The aurora had faded to normal darkness, and in the sudden silence, Marcus could hear something he hadn't experienced in days, the absence of music in his head. "Is it over?" Elena whispered. Dr. Chun was checking her equipment, all of which was now completely dead. "The electromagnetic signature is gone. Whatever was binding the entity to our reality has been severed." Marcus looked around the shop at the scattered remains of the music box, its intricate mechanisms now nothing more than broken metal and wood. What about all the people who heard the melody? David and Amanda and the others? "Look outside," Dr. Chan said softly. Marcus went to the window and saw David standing in the street, looking confused but very much alive and solid. As he watched, Amanda emerged from a nearby building, shaking her head as if waking from a long dream. Throughout the town, lights were beginning to come back on as the solar flare's effects faded and electronic systems reset themselves. But none of those systems carried the cursed melody anymore. The entity's connection to the modern world had been completely severed. "The souls that were released," Marcus said. "Are they?" "Free," Dr. Chun replied. "Finally, genuinely free. They used their last moments in our reality to break the binding that had held them, and their captor, for centuries." Marcus picked up a fragment of the music box's case, a piece of the intricate silver inlay that had once seemed so beautiful and mysterious. Now it was just metal with no supernatural properties at all. "Will it come back?" Dr. Chun consulted Elena's astronomical charts. "Not for another 200 years at minimum. The next celestial alignment that could support that kind of binding won't occur until well into the 23rd century. And even then," Elena added, "it would need someone to make a new bargain to create a new anchor. The knowledge of how to do that died with Madame Fontaine." Epilogue. 6 months later, Marcus reopened his shop with a new specialization: identifying and safely disposing of potentially dangerous antiques. Word had spread quietly through the academic community about his experience, and he found himself consulting on cases that most experts dismissed as folklore or psychological suggestion. Dr. Chan had become a regular collaborator, bringing her growing expertise in supernatural phenomena to bear on objects that exhibited unusual properties. Together, they had developed protocols for testing antiques safely, identifying supernatural influences before they could affect unsuspecting owners. David Chan had returned to his restoration work with no memory of the weeks he'd spent under the melody's influence, though he reported having unusually vivid dreams about dancing. Amanda Foster had resumed her position at the university, though she claimed she could no longer listen to waltz music without feeling inexplicably sad. The music box itself had been completely destroyed in the electromagnetic feedback, its fragments showing no trace of supernatural properties. Marcus had kept one small piece, a tiny silver dancing figure that had somehow survived the destruction, as a reminder of how beautiful something could appear while hiding monstrous purposes. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford had sent a thank you note 3 months after the incident, along with a check for far more money than Marcus had paid for the music box. Her note was brief. "Thank you for breaking the chain. Aunt Vivian's spirit visited me in a dream to tell me she was finally at peace." Marcus never asked how Mrs. Ashford had known the music box had been destroyed, or how she'd learned that her aunt's soul had been among those trapped within it. Some knowledge, he'd learned, came with too high a price to pursue. But late at night, when he was working alone in his shop, Marcus sometimes found himself humming melodies he'd never heard before. Simple tunes, pleasant and harmless, that seemed to come from somewhere in the depths of memory. When that happened, he would stop immediately and check every piece in his current inventory, making sure that he hadn't accidentally acquired another object that was more than it appeared. Because Marcus had learned that the most dangerous antiques were often the most beautiful ones, and that the price of perfect art was sometimes higher than any rational person would willingly pay. The dance was over, but the music, somewhere in some form, would always continue, and Marcus would always be listening for it. The end.